introducing Dr. Barbara Schneeman, who will give an introduction of FDA and the nutrition regulatory process.
Thank you very much, Shirley. As Dr. Blakely has indicated, I'm Barbara Schneeman. I'm Director of the Office of Nutrition Labeling and Dietary Supplements at the Food and Drug Administration. And it's also my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar and provide some introductory comments about FDA. Well, as Shirley has pointed out, this is a new format for us in presenting this material. We've been fortunate to have excellent assistance from JIFSAN in making the arrangements. And as a consequence, we've been able to reach out with information to a much larger audience and hope that this format will enable even more nutrition and dietetic students to understand FDA and its role in food safety and nutrition. So in my presentation today, I plan to give you a quick snapshot of our organization, some organizational issues, to provide you with some context in which FDA regulates the foods that it has jurisdiction over. And secondly, to discuss some of the tools that FDA can utilize to implement its mandate. As we go through the various presentations, you will learn about many examples in which we have used these tools. So I'll give you general information in those tools, and then over the next 2 days, you'll be hearing more about how we use those tools. So first, I have a question for you. I want to see where you think FDA is located in the federal government. Is it A, in the Department of Agriculture, B, in the Department of Health and Human Services, or C, a separate standalone agency that is not part of any of the cabinet level departments, or D, none of the above? So if those of you at the keyboard, if you could start showing your poll responses, and then we'll come back to that once we see some of the response. So a very important question is, what does FDA do? And at its most fundamental basis, our mission is protecting and promoting public health. These two goals are illustrated through the statements in the FDA mission statement that's found at www.fda.gov. On this slide are the statements from that mission statement about protecting public health and promoting public health. Okay, so let's see where we are with the poll. Aha, very good. So far we have 60% showing that FDA is in the Department of Health and Human Services. That's exactly where it is. FDA actually did start in the Department of Agriculture when it was the Bureau of Foods, but it's now part of the Department of Health and Human Services, and the commissioner of the FDA reports to the Secretary of HHS, who is currently Kathleen Sebelius. So if we go back to the mission statement, I put stars on here to show you that in the webinar today, we'll touch on many aspects of that mission, such as assuring that foods are safe, wholesome, sanitary, and properly labeled, that cosmetics and dietary supplements are safe and properly labeled, as well as ways in which we promote public health, such as advancing public health by helping to speed product innovations, making sure the public gets accurate, science-based information. So it's important to talk a little bit about organizational structure, just so that you have a picture of the broad scope of responsibilities within the agency. The FDA is led by a commissioner and the staff in her immediate office. Our current commissioner is Dr. Margaret Hamburg. The various product centers listed on this slide illustrate the different areas of responsibility within FDA, including drugs, biologics, medical devices, radiologic health, veterinary medicine, toxicology research, tobacco, which is actually just newly formed, cosmetics, and of course, food and nutrition. And the work that goes on in the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, or CFSAN, is where our focus will be in the webinar. FDA regulates domestic and imported foods with the exception of meat, poultry, frozen, dried, or liquid eggs, which are regulated by the Department of Agriculture. Okay, so let's have another poll, another question. And so this one is a simple respond true or false. Respond true or false to the statement, FDA regulates the food industry by creating statutes. So if you can enter your responses, and then we'll come back to that. Okay, so in this slide, I'm giving you some basic information on the organizational structure within CFSAN, which is how we refer to the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Mr. Michael Landa is our current center director. In addition to his office, there are about 9 program offices in the center. And when you see the titles of these offices, you see the various functions that CFSAN needs to perform. We have offices such as mine, which are nutrition, labeling, dietary supplement, offices that focus on food safety, food additive safety, compliance, emergency response, research. You see all of that listed in our office title names. Now here I've put a star against all of the various offices you're going to hear from in the webinar. So as you can see, you really are going to be hearing about a broad range in our scope of activities and how we regulate the safety of food for the American public. And I should point out that we also do have an Office of Colors and Cosmetics, and you'll be hearing from them as well. This just gives some information about the CFSAN organization in a text format rather than the illustration. So it basically gives the same information but puts it in text. So let's look back at the poll. Okay, 92% say it's false. So this is great. This means you really do remember your civics class and how a bill becomes law. Congress creates statutes, and these are enacted into law when signed by the president. And of course, once that goes into law, then FDA could be one of the agencies that has to figure out how do we implement what is being required in that law. Okay, so this slide then outlines 4 laws that are especially important for FDA. The agency, in fact, derives its legal authority to regulate certain products and the ways it can proceed to use that authority from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as amended, the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, the Public Health Service Act, and the Administrative Procedures Act. Other laws, of course, apply, but the discussion in the webinar is primarily focused around the legal authority that's found in these particular statutes. So, how does FDA use its legal authority? There's several ways in which the agency can use its legal authority. 3 of the primary routes are shown on this slide, and that includes the development of policy, such as that found in regulations and guidance documents, through enforcement or compliance activity. For example, if the agency sends a warning letter that indicates when a product is adulterated or misbranded, or through research to support its mission. And in what I'm going to focus on is really the first of these 3 activities that FDA can engage in, and that's the development of policy through regulations and guidance documents. So let's look at the steps that might be involved in the development of a regulation. Usually, some sort of review initiates the need for a regulation, and that can happen through several types of actions, such as a new law, as was mentioned. There could be a petition to the agency. There might be a judicial decision that affects how the agency operates, or the agency could decide to proceed through its own priority setting mechanisms. So if the review indicates that an action is needed to develop a regulation or modify an existing regulation, then a possible step for the agency is to publish an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, or an ANPR or ANPRM is how you'll hear people refer to it. and that gets published in the Federal Register. The ANPR is an opportunity for the agency to seek information by asking questions or soliciting certain types of information it needs to inform its decision. For example, it might ask for research on a relevant topic. The notice will contain information on where to submit the comments to the docket and the date by which comments should be received by the agency. It's important to note here that the agency is not required to publish an ANPR before proceeding with rulemaking, but it often finds it useful in order to obtain information. Other ways it might obtain information are through public meetings or by opening a docket where information can be submitted, a more general docket. So after review or after receiving information through an ANPR or some other mechanism, the agency can decide to do nothing, or it can decide to proceed with rulemaking. A proposed rule is published in the Federal Register and outlines the agency's thinking and tentative conclusions on the proposed regulation. It's seeking comment on that proposal, and those comments are very important that we review before making a final decision on the next course of action. So again, they are tentative conclusions at the point of a proposed rule. So if the agency, excuse me a minute, if the agency decides to proceed to a final rule or regulation, it would then show in that document of the final rule, it would present its conclusions on the regulation. It must respond to all of the comments that have come in on the proposal, and it would indicate an effective date when that regulation goes into effect. And keep in mind, depending on the input it receives in the process, it can decide to proceed to a final rule, or it could decide to do nothing or to take a different kind of action. So the comment and the input that we receive is very important. So I'm going to give you a little quiz at this point just to see if we're all paying attention. So the quiz is, what steps can FDA take to implement its legal authority? It can issue a proposed regulation for comment. B, it can issue guidance about FDA's thinking on its legal authority. C, it could warn a manufacturer that is not following the requirements in the statute. D, it can seek information by publishing an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. Or E, all of the above. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Now, I've put together a graphic just to give another way to look at how the agency might use its legal authority in the development of a regulation or a guidance. If the Federal Food and Drug Act is amended, and such an amendment could be through law, it amends the Federal Food and Drug Act. For example, later in the webinar, you'll hear about the requirements for menu labeling have in fact amended the Federal Food, Drug and Law to require certain things. It can then go through the steps I've talked about, an advance notice of proposed rulemaking or putting out a proposed rule, and those are the steps for notice and comment. So we've given notice about what we're proposing, and then we take comment from the public. If it develops a final rule, that then is published in the Code of Federal Regulations, which is shown at the top of your slide with the kind of pink purpley binder on it. That's a scan of the CFR. It's referred to, the Code of Federal Regulations. The CFR is where all of the regulations are published, the federal regulations. And there's one part that has most of the regulations that FDA administers. So another option for the agency, however, is it can also develop a document that's referred to as guidance for industry. So a guidance document provides information on the agency's thinking. How are we, in fact, viewing an interpretation of the statute or an interpretation of the regulations. So it gives the agencies thinking, but guidance generally is not viewed as enforceable. However, what's in the CFR can in fact have the force of law. So in publishing a proposed or final rule in the Federal Register, there are several sections, and I highlight this mainly to have you understand that there's several types of analysis that a proposed rule or a final rule needs to go through. They can seem very dense to read, but these sections are needed to justify the agency's actions. So the first part of this, the background, the petitions and grounds, that might be where the scientific rationale for what we're doing is explained. There has to be a legal authority analysis in terms of what's in the statute. For many of the labeling requirements, that also has to include a First Amendment analysis, since labeling is about speech. And then the proposed or final rule goes through, why do we need this regulation? What different types of options did the agency consider? How are we going to revise the regulatory language? What's actually going to change? There's a regulatory impact analysis. This is basically an economic analysis of the costs and benefits of the proposed rule. And then there's several additional sections, unfunded mandates, paperwork reduction, whole variety of things that have to be looked at and analyzed by the agency in a proposed or final rule. Now, for most of the policy developed for the Food and Nutrition Program, scientific input is obviously very critically important for our decision making. We are a science-based organization, and we obtain that type of scientific input through several routes. And I've listed some of those on this slide because it's an opportunity for those of you who are in science or considering careers in science to think about how you give input on what the agency is working on. We do look to authoritative sources such as the National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine in particular, the peer-reviewed scientific literature. We can at times do expert consultations such as an advisory committee, a public meeting, or individual consultants that we can bring in on particular topics. The comments to the dockets can also provide scientific input, and it's important that these reflect an independent evaluation, identify relevant resources that could be useful to the agency, and if there are any potential conflict of interest, that those be identified. And then within the federal government itself, once a proposed or final rule or guidance document is developed, it often has to be reviewed at several levels within the government. Obviously, it might start in the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, but then the FDA Commissioner's Office is involved with that review. There's an Office of General Counsel, basically our legal advisors who review it. The department itself needs to look at it, and then eventually the Office of Management and Budget, which would include the White House and other federal agencies. So there's quite a bit of review that goes in before a document is published. Some people often wonder, why does it take so long to change regulations? And you can see the process wants to make sure that there's a thorough review before changes are made. So coming back, and it looks like we have a high percentage of you recognize that all of the above, all of these are ways that FDA can take to implement its legal authority. While I've focused on A, B, and D, ways that we might develop regulation, guidance, or gain input, another way that we can in fact use our legal authority is when we send warning letters. Great. So just to finish up, I've used some terms throughout the presentation, and I think it's important you keep in mind what these terms mean, because you'll probably be hearing them throughout the webinar, an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, a way, or an ANPR, a way for us to obtain information, a notice of proposed rulemaking. Again, that's where we put out our tentative conclusions about what we think should be in a regulation. A Federal Register notice, or the Federal Register, this is where we publish things such as ANPRMs or proposed rules. So that's that federal document that contains that information. A docket is something where you can submit comments, and the Code of Federal Regulations is where we in fact publish the regulations that we are in fact working with. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. I think we have a little bit of time if there are any questions. Shirley, do we have some questions that we want to?
Please enter your questions on the keyboard, and we will, using the raised hand chat area, and we will respond to your questions. Thanks. We have a few minutes to take some questions.
And I see there was one question here of what do you mean by dockets? And as I indicated, the docket is actually where comments can be submitted. And whenever there's a notice in the Federal Register, it will assign a docket number. And then if a comment is submitted, it would need to be submitted to that particular docket. Dockets is also a place where, for example, if we've referenced a particular publication in a proposed rule, that publication could be available if someone wants to actually come in and physically review that material. But the docket, generally, it's where you would submit comments. And those can be done electronically. It used to be that they had to be mailed in, but they can now be done electronically as long as it's done before the closing date that is published.
And we have another question, Barbara. Perhaps you would just like to go ahead and follow up with that question. It says, how does FDA announce new rules for the industry?
So, as it indicated, a new rule or a new proposed rule or final rule would be published in the Federal Register. So the Federal Register is the document that in fact contains that proposed rule or final rule. Obviously, we recognize that not everyone is that familiar with the Federal Register. So generally, we would have a press announcement. FDA does have a constituent update list. It's an email list that people can sign up for. So there's several ways that we would announce what that rule would be to get that information out to the public. And we participate in a variety of different formats as well to explain what is in. For example, when we put forward the final rule for dietary supplements for good manufacturing practices, we did a major series of rollouts in which we had webinars, we had presentations, we had a lot of information going out to be sure that we informed everyone of what the requirements were. And we also have had a lot of training sessions so people understand how can they implement those new requirements.
Well, we have another question. That is, what is the role of the the White House in approving proposed rules?
With when we're publishing a regulation, it's reviewed at multiple layers within the government. So, for example, it's reviewed. A lot of the review happens within the agency itself, and then it would go to the department. So at that point, the Department of Health and Human Services, they do a review, they consult with various agencies within HHS, and then it goes to the Office of Management and Budget. And once it goes to the Office of Management and Budget, that is a broader government look at the regulation and its impact, and could include the White House at that point as well in terms of their review of the regulation.
And moving on to the next question, is FDA bound to seek external advice? If it does so, should FDA justify how it makes its own opinion from scientific inputs, which might be different?
Yes, FDA is required to seek external advice. That's why we use a notice and comment process where we provide a proposed rule, tentative conclusions, and we seek comment on that. And for example, when we go from a proposed rule to a final rule, we in fact look at all of the comments, and in that final rule, there will be sections that show how does the agency respond to those comments that came in. And many times that can be a scientific issue. There could be other issues related to our legal authority, but in going forward, we seek that external input. There's a process to do that. There are timelines that have to be met. We have to receive comments within a certain time period. And then in moving forward from that, we do in fact respond to the comments.
And here's another question. How long will the process usually take for a proposed rule from the start until it becomes a rule?
I would say it's very difficult to estimate a timeline because it will vary tremendously by the nature of the rule. Something that's very simple and straightforward might proceed quickly. Some of the more complex rules can take a much longer time just because of the complexity of the issues. So it's probably difficult to put a simple timeline on what it takes to proceed.
Well, we have several more questions, and there's one question which I think I will take advantage and answer. Will you repeat where and when these presentations will be available after the webinar? And the presentations will be available on the JIFSAN website. And if you have a pen or a pencil, I will just read it to you, but it's going to appear on a slide later in the day. So the URL for the JIFSAN website is www.jifsan, that is JIFSAN, .umd, as in University of Maryland, .edu. And we will put that in the webinars for you so that you can see it. And they will be available, the recordings are available within 30 days. So thank you for that question. And then I'm going to move to the next question for Dr. Schneeman. And that is, what is the difference between a statute and a regulation?
So the statutes are what are enacted into law. So for example, I referred to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That is a statute that gives us our legal authority. The regulations that we have been talking about are ways in which we can implement what is in the statute. So I referred to the Code of Federal Regulations. That's where you would find the regulations that are published, but it's a way to implement what is in the statute.
And I think we have one, is it time? Or we may be able to, we'll take one last question. And that question is, why does FDA provide guidance in question format? It seems that the information is missed. It seems that information is missed in this type of format.
FDA provides guidance in several different types of formats. And sometimes the Q&A format is used because we are indeed trying to address the types of questions that have been coming to us about how we're interpreting a particular statute or interpreting a particular regulation. So often we're receiving those questions, and so we are responding in guidance with that information in a Q&A format. But there are other types of guidances that are there. For example, if we write a letter to manufacturers, that would be in a narrative format. So there are other ways that we do provide guidance.
I want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Schneeman for her presentation and thank all of you for your interesting questions. We love it when you give us a lot of questions, so keep them coming. We are sorry we didn't get to every single question. They came in, some came in after we got started, but we definitely are on the right track. So please keep your questions coming.